It starts with a key. But before you hear about the key, you need to understand the cage. If you've ever felt invisible at your job, if you've ever been the one holding everything together while others took the credit, then stick with me for a little while. It helps to know I'm not just screaming this story into the void. My name is Bianca, and for 30 years, I was a ghost. For 3 decades, I was the housekeeper at the Vance estate, a sprawling prison of marble and manicured lawns ruled by Eleanor Vance, a woman whose heart was colder than the stone floors I polished every morning. The reading of the will was held in the grand library, a room where I was only ever allowed to enter with a duster and a bottle of lemon oil. I stood by the door, as was my station, a living statue in a simple black dress. The air was thick with the scent of old paper and greed. Eleanor's 3 children, Richard, Catherine, and Julian, were arranged in the center of the room like vultures waiting for the last breath to leave a dying animal. They had been waiting their whole lives. Richard, the eldest, was a man whose ambition had long since outgrown his talent. He sat with his hands steepled, a posture he'd copied from his father's portrait, trying to project an aura of command that fit him like a child's coat. Catherine, draped in silk that cost more than my yearly salary, was already texting her interior designer, a faint, predatory smile playing on her lips. And Julian, the youngest, the perpetual screw-up, just looked impatient, fidgeting with his cufflinks, no doubt calculating how quickly he could liquidate his share to fund his next failed venture. They had never seen me. Not really. In 30 years, I was a pair of hands that refilled a glass, a silent presence that cleared a plate, a shadow that fluffed a pillow. I was furniture, useful but inanimate. Their mother had been cruel. Yes, but her cruelty had the sharp, clean edge of a diamond. Theirs was a blunt, sloppier malice, the casual cruelty of people who have never once had to consider the existence of another human being outside of what they could provide. Mr. Abernathy, Eleanor's lawyer for half a century, cleared his throat. He was a man made of tweed and quiet integrity, and his eyes, when they briefly met mine, held a flicker of something that might have been pity. Or perhaps something else. He began to read. The litany of assets was staggering. The Manhattan penthouse, the Hamptons estate, the portfolio of commercial properties downtown, the art collection, the stocks, the bonds. With each item, the children straightened a little more, their smiles growing sharper, their entitlement calcifying in the quiet room. Finally, Mr. Abernathy reached the end. Richard was to be the executor, the new patriarch. The assets were to be divided equally among the 3 of them. A clean, simple transfer of power. They started murmuring to each other, their voices crisp with victory. Richard was already talking about selling the art. Catherine was planning a renovation that would erase the last vestiges of her mother's taste. Then Mr. Abernathy held up a hand. "There is one final item," he said, his voice dropping a little. "A personal bequest from Eleanor Vance to her housekeeper of 30 years, Bianca Rossi." A silence fell. It wasn't a respectful silence. It was a confused, annoyed silence, the kind that happens when a television show is interrupted by a special news bulletin. The 3 of them turned, as one, to look at me. It was the most direct eye contact I'd had from any of them in my entire life. Their eyes weren't hostile. Not yet. They were just blank, as if they were trying to place where they had seen this particular piece of furniture before. Mr. Abernathy opened a small, velvet-lined box on the table. "For Bianca Rossi," he read, "I leave the key to the old garden shed. May she find it as useful as I have." He looked up at me. Richard let out a short, sharp laugh, a bark of disbelief. "The garden shed?" he said, looking at his siblings. "The one we're demolishing next month?" Catherine giggled, a sound like tiny shards of glass. "How rustic," she drawled. It was a final joke from beyond the grave, a final perfect twist of Eleanor's famously black humor. They saw it as the ultimate insult, a confirmation of my status. The servant gets the servants' quarters, or what was left of them. The shed was a rotting heap of wood and rust at the far end of the property, filled with broken pots and forgotten tools. It was worthless. Richard strode over to the table. He picked up the key. It was old, iron, and caked with a deep orange rust. He didn't walk over to me. He held it out, expecting me to approach him, to cross the floor and take it from his hand like a dog receiving a scrap. I didn't move. I just stood there by the door and met his gaze. For the first time, he was forced to really look at me, and I could see the flicker of irritation in his eyes. The help was not behaving. With an exasperated sigh, he walked over and dropped the key into my hand. The metal was cold and heavy. "There you go, Bianca," he said, his voice dripping with a magnanimous condescension that was far more insulting than the gift itself. "Don't spend it all in one place." Catherine and Julian snickered. They turned their backs on me then, their moment of amusement over, the furniture put back in its place. I was dismissed. My 30 years of service, my life, my loyalty, all of it was weighed, measured, and compensated with a rusty key to a pile of rotting wood. They thought they were closing a chapter. They thought they were delivering a final, crushing humiliation. They had no idea. They didn't know that this key wasn't about the past. It was about the future. They didn't know the key didn't open the shed. And they certainly didn't know that the week before she died, Eleanor Vance, in a final, brilliant act of spite against the children she despised, had her lawyer draw up a new set of deeds, the original, legally binding deeds to every single property they had just inherited, and she had signed them all over to me. This rusty piece of iron wasn't a key to a shed, it was a key to a safe deposit box, and it was the key to my new life. I closed my hand around the cold, heavy metal. It wasn't about revenge. It was about balance. For 30 years, the world had been tilted, and I was about to set it right. I walked out of that library and didn't look back. The air outside was cool and clean, and for the first time in 3 decades, it tasted like freedom. I went back to my small room in the servants' wing, a space that had been my entire world, a cell with comfortable bedding. The door clicked shut behind me, and the sound, which had always felt like a lock turning, now sounded like a seal breaking. The performance was over. I was finally alone, and I fell apart. It wasn't a loud, dramatic collapse. It was a silent implosion. I sat on the edge of my single bed, the one with the mattress that dipped in the middle from the weight of 10,000 sleepless nights, and I let the facade crumble. The calm, composed housekeeper dissolved, and what was left was just me. A 52-year-old woman with calloused hands and a life spent in the shadows. The tears didn't come. I was too tired for tears. It was more like a slow leak, a pressure valve releasing 30 years of compressed humiliation, of bitten tongues and swallowed pride. The rusty key was still clutched in my fist, its teeth digging into my palm, a painful, grounding sensation. My mind, unchained from its duty, began to race backward. It wasn't a gentle stream of memories, it was a flood, a torrent of small, sharp moments that put together formed the bars of my cage. I remembered my first day. I was 22, fresh from a family tragedy that had left me destitute and desperate. Eleanor Vance had hired me herself. She hadn't been looking for a housekeeper. She told me later, in one of her rare, unguarded moments, that she was looking for someone who knew what it felt like to have nothing, because only they understand the value of protecting what is everything. It was a cruel kind of logic, but it was Eleanor's logic. I remembered a young Richard, then a teenager, deliberately spilling a glass of red wine on a priceless Persian rug just to watch me scrub it on my hands and knees. He had stood over me, a smirk on his face, and said, "That's what we pay you for, isn't it?" I remembered Catherine, as a young woman, losing a diamond earring and accusing me of theft. The house was turned upside down. I was subjected to the quiet, chilling threat of a police search, my small room ransacked, my dignity stripped bare. The earring was later found in her own jewelry box, a discovery she greeted not with an apology, but with an irritated sigh, as if my innocence was a profound inconvenience to her. And Julian, sweet, useless Julian, who would leave $1,000 cashmere sweaters crumpled on the floor, stained with food and drink, knowing I would be the one to painstakingly hand wash and restore them, a task that took hours. He never once said thank you. These weren't isolated incidents. They were the texture of my life, the daily, grinding reality of being invisible. I wasn't just a housekeeper. Over the years, my role had bled into something more. Eleanor was a demanding, difficult woman. But she was sharp. She saw the incompetence in her own children long before they did. I started balancing the household checkbook because Julian kept making a mess of it. I started coordinating with vendors and contractors for repairs because Richard would always try to skim a percentage off the top, a petty grift that infuriated his mother. I was the one who knew which circuit breaker controlled the west wing, which plumber to call for the antique pipes, which of the gardeners was stealing silverware. I became the estate's memory, its central nervous system. I ran the house, all of it, from the shadows. And my pay remained the same. My title remained the same, housekeeper. I think that's why I stayed. It's a question people might ask. Why endure it for so long? It's a debatable choice, I know. It wasn't just loyalty, and it wasn't fear. It was a project. In the beginning, it was survival. But later, it became a quiet, stubborn refusal to be broken. Every time they slighted me, every time they dismissed me, I would learn something new. I would listen. Eleanor conducted her business from the home office, the door always slightly ajar. I would hear her on the phone with her lawyers, with her brokers, with her business partners. I learned about trusts and estates, about holding companies and tax shelters, not from books but from snippets of conversation overheard while dusting. I absorbed it all. It was my secret education. It was my armor. Staying was my own strange act of defiance. I was a fixture, a constant, and in my own way I was more a part of that house than they ever were. They were merely its temporary occupants. I was its foundation. There was a moment, about 5 years ago, that planted the seed of all this. Eleanor had been ill with the flu, confined to her bed. The children were, of course, nowhere to be seen. I was bringing her a tray of broth and tea. She was weak, her voice a reedy whisper. She looked at me. Her eyes, usually so hard, were clouded with fever. "You run this house, Bianca," she'd said, out of nowhere. "Not them. They couldn't run a bath without drowning in it." She'd coughed, a dry, rattling sound. "They're waiting for me to die. They circle like buzzards. But they don't know how to hunt. They only know how to eat what's already dead." It was the closest she ever came to a compliment, and even that was barbed. But it was also a confession, a statement of fact. She saw them for what they were, and in that moment, she saw me. My mind snapped back to the present, to the cold room, the rusty key. The weight of those memories, the sheer volume of the injustice, it could have crushed me. It could have been the end. I could have taken the key, walked away, and disappeared into a life of quiet obscurity. That was the breakdown. That was the low point. The crushing weight of 30 years pressing down on my soul. But then came the catalyst. I stood up and went to my small writing desk, tucked away in the back of the top drawer, beneath stacks of old letters from my sister, was a small, sealed envelope. It was made of the same heavy, cream-colored paper that Eleanor used for her personal correspondence. On the front, in her spidery, elegant script, was my name. Just Bianca. Mr. Abernathy had slipped it to me discreetly as I was leaving the library. A silent, meaningful glance his only instruction. My hands were trembling slightly as I opened it. Inside was not a letter, but a small, folded note. The paper was stiff. Her handwriting was weaker here, shakier, but still undeniably hers. It read, "The key is not for the shed, you fool. It's for Box 317 at the Sterling National Bank on 57th. Abernathy knows. They think this house, this money, is their birthright. A birthright is earned. They have earned nothing. You have earned everything. Don't let them win. EV." And just like that, the despair vanished. It didn't fade away. It was incinerated. In its place, a cold, clear resolve settled into my bones. It was the feeling of a switch being thrown, of a circuit finally connecting. The years of quiet observation, of silent study, of enduring humiliation, it all clicked into place. It wasn't wasted time. It was training. It wasn't servitude. It was an apprenticeship. She called me a fool. Even in her final act of twisted generosity, she had to get in one last jab. I almost smiled. That was Eleanor. Cruel but precise, demanding, but in her own way, fair. She hadn't left me a gift. She had left me a weapon and a command. Don't let them win. I looked at the key in my hand again. The rust didn't seem like decay anymore. It looked like dried blood. A promise. It wasn't about revenge. I told myself that then, and I tell myself that now. It was a debatable point, of course. My motives were not simple. But at that moment, it felt like something purer. It was about fulfilling a final duty. It was about honoring the strange, complex 30-year bond between two women who understood each other in a way no one else could. Eleanor had built an empire. Her children were about to burn it down for parts. She had chosen me, the housekeeper, the ghost, to be its custodian, because she knew I was the only one who had ever truly seen its value. I slept that night for the first time in years. A deep, dreamless sleep. I woke up the next morning, not as Bianca the housekeeper, but as Bianca the heir. The game had been set. The pieces were in place, and I was ready to make my first move. The plan wasn't mine. Not really. It was Eleanor's. I was merely its executor, the role that Richard so proudly thought was his. Eleanor had been laying the groundwork for years, a quiet, strategic campaign conducted from her sickbed. My role, up until her death, had been one of ignorance. I was an unwitting pawn. But her final note, that small piece of cream-colored paper, had promoted me to queen. The next morning, I called Mr. Abernathy. I used the private line in Eleanor's study, a room I had never been allowed to use, but now walked into as if I owned it. Which I suppose I did. He answered on the first ring. "Bianca," he said, his voice calm and steady. "I was expecting your call." That was the first time I realized the depth of his involvement. Mr. Abernathy wasn't just the family lawyer. He was my ally. He had watched the same slow-motion tragedy I had, the decay of a great legacy at the hands of 3 grasping, inadequate children. He had served Eleanor for 50 years, and his loyalty was to her, not to her name. And her final wish was now his mission. We met that afternoon at his dusty, book-lined office downtown. It was a world away from the sterile, modern conference rooms that Richard favored. It smelled of leather and justice. Mr. Abernathy laid it all out for me, the architecture of Eleanor's final, brilliant maneuver. It was a masterpiece of legal spite. "She started preparing this 5 years ago," he explained, steepling his fingers, echoing Richard's posture, but with an authenticity that Richard could never muster. "Right after her first major health scare, the one you nursed her through. She saw, with perfect clarity, that her children were not stewards, they were locusts." He explained that the will he'd read was perfectly legal. It was her most recent will, bequeathing the estate to her children. However, the ownership of property isn't ultimately determined by a will. It's determined by the name on the deed. A will can direct an executor to transfer a deed, but if the deceased no longer owned the property at the time of their death, there is nothing to transfer. It's a subtle but critical distinction, one that relies on a specific sequence of events, a kind of legal sleight of hand. "A week before she died," he continued, "Eleanor and I executed a series of quitclaim deeds. It was all perfectly legal and above board. She was lucid, of sound mind. I made sure of it. In fact, I have a video recording of the entire proceeding, witnessed by a notary and her physician. In it, she transfers ownership of every single property, every holding company, every last brick and share, to a trust for which you, Bianca, are the sole beneficiary and trustee." My breath caught in my throat. A trust. I knew the word from my eavesdropping. It was a legal fortress. "The deeds you will find in the safe deposit box are the new, superseding originals," he said. "The copies on file at the county recorder's office have already been updated. It's a public record. But no one ever thinks to check the county recorder's office for properties they believe they already own. Especially not people like Richard, who believe their ownership is a matter of divine right, not public paperwork. This is the genius of it, Bianca," he said, leaning forward. "The will gives them the illusion of ownership. It satisfies their greed and keeps them occupied with their squabbling. But the trust gives you the reality of it. They have inherited a portfolio of beautiful, empty shells. The titles are yours. I thought about my secret education. the years spent listening at doorways. I had heard Eleanor talk about asset protection, about moving wealth into vehicles that were insulated from attack. I never imagined I would be the vehicle. My subplot in this grand drama was my own quiet competence. Eleanor knew I managed the household accounts. She knew I could stretch a budget and negotiate with vendors. What she probably didn't know was how deeply I had absorbed the language of her world. I asked Mr. Abernathy, "What about the operating accounts, the cash flow from the commercial properties?" His eyes lit up with a hint of a smile. That's the second phase. The trust is now the legal owner of the holding companies that own the properties. As trustee, you have the authority to redirect all rental income and dividend payments to a new bank account, one which you will open this afternoon. The accounts the children currently have access to will within a few business days run dry. Their credit lines are secured against assets they no longer own. Those lines will be frozen. It was breathtaking. It was a silent, bloodless coup. It wasn't just taking the house, it was taking the engine, the money, the power, the entire system that propped up their useless lives. He slid a packet of papers across the desk to me. "These are the documents for the bank. Your new identification, everything you need. Box 317. Sterling National Bank. The key you have is one of two. I have the other, as is standard for a lawyer-client relationship of this nature. You will need both my key and yours to access the box. It's a security measure Eleanor insisted upon." I looked at him. "Mr. Abernathy, why are you doing this? For me?" He shook his head slowly. "I am doing this for Eleanor Vance," he said softly. "I am honoring my client's last wish. And my client believed, quite correctly, that her legacy was safer in the hands of the woman who polished her silver than in the hands of the children who would have sold it for scrap." He paused, looking at me with an appraising eye. "She also said you were the only person she knew with the stomach to see it through. She said you had a spine of steel hidden under that uniform. I am beginning to see she was right." His validation was a balm on a 30-year-old wound. For the first time, I felt like an equal in a room with a man in a suit. My hidden leverage wasn't just the deeds, it was my own character, forged in the fires of their disrespect. I had been underestimated, and as Eleanor knew, that is the ultimate strategic advantage. We went to the bank that very afternoon. Sterling National Bank was a cathedral of wealth, all marble columns and hushed tones. I was still in my simple black dress, but walking beside Mr. Abernathy, I felt a strange sense of belonging. We were led to the vault. A circular door, thick as a tree trunk, hissed open. The air inside was cold, dry, and still. It smelled of paper and time. The attendant, a severe-looking woman, led us to a wall of gleaming metal boxes. She unlocked one side of box 317 with a master key. Then she looked at us. Mr. Abernathy inserted his key. I, with a hand that was surprisingly steady, inserted the rusty iron key from the shed. There was a solid, satisfying click. The two-key system was a classic Eleanor touch, a bit of theater, a dash of paranoia. The attendant pulled out a long, heavy metal box and placed it on a table in a small private viewing room. She left, closing the door behind us. For a moment, we just stood there, looking at it. The final piece of the puzzle, the heart of the empire. I lifted the lid. It was filled to the brim with documents, thick stacks of paper, bound in ribbon. On top of the first stack was a single sheet of paper. It was another note from Eleanor. "Property is power, Bianca. Don't ever forget that. Now, go raise hell. E.V." I picked up the top deed. The Vance Tower, 1112 Broad Street. The legal description, the parcel number, and at the bottom, the transfer of ownership from Eleanor Vance to the Blackwood Trust. And on the accompanying trust document, my name Bianca Rossi, trustee. I leafed through the stack. The penthouse, the Hamptons estate, a row of brownstones in Brooklyn, a small shopping center in Westchester. It went on and on. It was a kingdom on paper. The weight of it was immense, not just the physical weight of the documents, but the moral weight. This was real. It wasn't about revenge, I told myself again, the phrase becoming a mantra. It was about stewardship. It was a debatable point, of course, a flimsy shield for the cold, hard satisfaction that was beginning to bloom in my chest. But it was the shield I needed. I spent the next 2 hours in that room with Mr. Abernathy, signing papers, opening the new trust account, drafting letters of direction to the various property management companies. Every signature felt like a stone being laid in the foundation of my new life. By the time we walked out of that bank, the silent takeover was already in motion. The children were celebrating their inheritance, drinking champagne and making plans. They had no idea that the ground beneath their feet had already been sold. The first move had to be silent, precise, and undeniable. It couldn't be a dramatic confrontation. That was their style, not mine. My style, learned over 30 years of quiet observation, was to simply change the facts on the ground, to let reality do the heavy lifting. After leaving the bank, Mr. Abernathy and I worked through the late afternoon. He was the strategist, and I was the implementer. He drafted the formal notices. I provided the specific details he needed, the names of the property managers for the commercial buildings, the account numbers for the utilities at the various residences, the security company that serviced the main estate, all the information I had absorbed over the years, the invisible labor of running their lives, was now being weaponized. The first target was the most symbolic, the house, the grand estate that had been my prison. That evening, as Richard, Catherine, and Julian were likely having a celebratory dinner at some overpriced restaurant, I made a call. "Hello, this is Bianca Rossi," I said to the representative at Sterling Security. "I am calling on behalf of the new owner of the property at 1400 Willow Lane, the Blackwood Trust. I need to schedule an immediate lock and code change for all external doors and gates." The woman on the other end was professional and efficient. There was a pause as she, no doubt, checked her records. I could hear the faint clicking of a keyboard. "Oh yes, I see the notification here from the legal department. The Blackwood Trust. We can have a team out there in 2 hours." It was that simple. No argument, no debate. The name on the account had changed. The old authority was gone. I sat in my small room, listening to the clock tick, and imagined the tumblers and the locks being replaced, the old keys, including the ones in the children's pockets, being rendered useless pieces of metal. The next morning, I began the second wave of the attack. Mr. Abernathy's office sent out a dozen couriered letters. They went to the management firms that handled the Vance Tower and the other commercial properties. The letter was simple and legally airtight. It stated that the Blackwood Trust was the new legal owner of the properties, and that effective immediately, all rental income was to be deposited into a new account, the details of which were provided. It also rescinded all prior management directives and named me, Bianca Rossi, as the sole authorized representative. Any communication from Richard, Catherine, or Julian Vance regarding the properties was to be ignored. This was the masterstroke. It didn't just cut off their future income. It delegitimized them. It turned them from owners into nuisances overnight. I knew Richard used an office in the Vance Tower as his personal headquarters, a place from which he ran his pathetic little consulting firm that leached off his family's name. He would feel this one personally. The panic began, as I expected, with Julian. He was the weakest and the most coddled. He treated the main estate like his personal hotel. He drove up to the main gate around noon, likely planning to grab a few bottles of wine from the cellar and lounge by the pool. I watched from an upstairs window as his expensive sports car pulled up to the gate. He pressed the button on the call box. Silence. He pressed it again, harder this time. Then he got out of his car and tried his key in the pedestrian gate. It didn't turn. I could see the confusion on his face. It was the look of a man who had never encountered a door that didn't open for him. He got out his phone and made a call. I could guess who it was. An hour later, Richard arrived. His black sedan pulled up behind Julian's car. He got out, looking furious, the picture of aggrieved authority. He strode to the gate and used his own key. Nothing. I saw him yelling into his phone. He was calling the security company, no doubt. I could imagine the conversation. "I'm Richard Vance, the owner," and the calm, professional voice on the other end saying, "I'm sorry, sir. Our records show a different owner. Please contact the Blackwood Trust." The Blackwood Trust. A meaningless name to them, a ghost entity. The confusion would now be morphing into a cold, creeping dread. They had no idea who they were fighting. The call from Catherine came in the early afternoon. She had tried to buy a $5,000 handbag, and her card was declined. The card linked the main estate account. She was apoplectic. She called Richard, screaming down the phone. I know because he called Abernathy's office immediately after, and Abernathy patched the call through to me on speakerphone so I could listen. What the hell is going on, Abernathy? Richard's voice was tight with fury. The locks have been changed at the house. Catherine's cards have been shut off. Is this some kind of probate nonsense? Mr. Abernathy's voice was as dry as autumn leaves. I'm afraid I'm no longer at liberty to discuss the Vance estate with you, Richard. My client is now the Blackwood Trust. All inquiries should be directed to them. Who the hell is the Blackwood Trust? Richard yelled. Is this a creditor? Did my mother have some secret debt? I suggest you consult your own legal counsel, Mr. Abernathy replied coolly. I have no further information for you. And he hung up. The beauty of it was in the silence, the lack of information. They were fighting shadows. They were trapped outside their own lives. Looking in, they were experiencing, for the first time, a fraction of the powerlessness I had felt every day for 30 years. The true moment of panic, the one I savored the most, was relayed to me later that day by a source. One of the property managers at the Vance Tower, a man named Henderson whom I had always been courteous to, called Mr. Abernathy's office. He felt it his duty to report a disturbance. Richard Vance had tried to enter his office on the 40th floor, and his keycard had been denied. He had caused a scene in the lobby, shouting that he owned the building. The new security chief, following the new directives, had politely but firmly escorted him out. Humiliated, publicly, in the lobby of the building that bore his family's name. He wasn't a titan of industry anymore. He was just a man who had been locked out of his office. The foundation of their identities was cracking. They weren't the Vances, owners of everything. They were just Richard, Catherine, and Julian. And without the Vance fortune, they were nothing. Their panic was a symphony. They began calling each other, lawyers, accountants. They were trying to understand the logistics of their own demise. But they were looking in the wrong place. They were looking at the will, at the probate court. They assumed a clerical error, a legal challenge they could overcome. They couldn't conceive of a reality where they had been so thoroughly and completely outmaneuvered. They couldn't imagine that the architect of their ruin was the same woman who used to serve them their morning coffee. I sat in Eleanor's study, at her grand mahogany desk, and looked out over the sprawling lawns, the lawns I used to inspect for weeds, the gardens I used to oversee, the house I used to clean. It was all mine. The silence of the house was absolute. It was the silence of victory. It wasn't about the money. That's what I kept telling myself. It was about the quiet, the peace, the beautiful resounding silence where their arrogant voices used to be. It was the sound of balance being restored. The power shift was not a single event, but a cascade. It was like watching a dam break in slow motion. The initial cracks, the changed locks, the frozen accounts were just the beginning. The real collapse came as the consequences rippled outward, dismantling the very structures of their lives. Their world was built on a single assumption, that they were the Vances, and the world owed them deference. Their credit, their social standing, their entire sense of self was secured against properties they no longer owned. And once that foundation was removed, the entire edifice came crashing down. Mr. Abernathy became my eyes and ears, a loyal source of intelligence from the world they used to command. He received frantic calls from their new second-rate lawyers, who were quickly discovering the brick wall of the Blackwood Trust. They demanded copies of the deeds. Mr. Abernathy happily obliged. The silence on the other end of the phone, he told me, was deeply satisfying. Their first official countermove was predictable. They filed a lawsuit. They claimed that Eleanor was not of sound mind when she signed the deeds. They alleged undue influence. Their target wasn't me, not directly. They didn't know I was the beneficiary yet. Their target was the shadowy Blackwood Trust, which they probably imagined was some corporate raider or a secret creditor of their mother's. They were suing a ghost. This was the moment Abernathy had prepared for. He responded to their legal filing with a single devastating piece of evidence, the video, the high-definition recording of Eleanor Vance, sitting up in her bed a week before her death. Her physician was there, attesting to her lucidity. The notary was there. Mr. Abernathy was there. And Eleanor, in a voice that was weak but utterly clear, looked directly into the camera. "I am Eleanor Vance," she said. "I am of sound mind and body, apart from the tedious business of dying. I am signing these documents today to transfer my entire real estate portfolio to the Blackwood Trust. I do this freely and without coercion. My children Richard, Catherine, and Julian have proven themselves to be constitutionally incapable of managing anything beyond their own vanity. They are not fit to inherit. This is my final word on the matter." It was a legal nuke. Their case evaporated on the spot. Their lawyers, upon viewing the video, advised them to withdraw the suit immediately. To proceed would be to risk not only losing, but being forced to pay Abernathy's legal fees. It was a total, humiliating defeat. And it was at this point that Abernathy played his final card. In his formal correspondence to their lawyers, he revealed the trustee and sole beneficiary of the Blackwood Trust, Bianca Rossi. I cannot imagine the scene when they received that news. The sheer unadulterated shock, the brain-breaking cognitive dissonance of it. The housekeeper, the furniture, the ghost. It wasn't a corporate raider or a secret billionaire. It was me, the person they had spent 30 years ignoring. The humiliation of being outmaneuvered by a faceless entity was one thing, but to be defeated by me, that was a wound to the ego from which they would never recover. The exodus of their social and financial capital was swift. News travels fast in those circles. The story, in its delicious scandalous detail, was too good not to share. The Vances were no longer the Vances. They were the disinherited, the butt of a joke played by their own mother from beyond the grave. Invitations to charity galas dried up. Their supposed friends stopped returning their calls. They were social pariahs. Their financial ruin was even more complete. The banks that held the credit lines against the properties called in their debts. Without the rental income, they had no way to pay. They had to sell their expensive cars, their designer clothes, their jewelry. Catherine, I heard, had to move out of her lavish apartment, which was in her name but paid for by an allowance from the estate that no longer existed. Richard's sham consulting firm imploded. He had no clients that weren't a result of his mother's influence. Their desperate counter came about a week later. It was pathetic. Richard called Mr. Abernathy. He was a different man. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a thin, wheedling tone. He wanted to arrange a meeting with me. He said he wanted to discuss a settlement. He proposed a fair and equitable split of the assets. He suggested that I, out of my long and loyal service to the family, would surely see that this was the right thing to do. He was appealing to the very sense of duty he had spent his life mocking. I had Abernathy relay my answer. Miss Rossi is not interested in a settlement. The matter is closed. They tried again, this time through Catherine. She left me a voicemail. I didn't have a personal number they knew, so she left it on the main house line, which now rang on the phone in my study. Her voice was unrecognizable. It was soft, pleading. "Bianca," she said, as if we were old friends. "I know we may have had our differences over the years, but we're family, in a way. Mother was difficult for all of us. I'm sure we can come to an arrangement that benefits everyone. Please, just talk to me." I deleted the message without a reply. It wasn't about revenge, I reminded myself, but listening to their desperation, to the complete inversion of our power dynamic, felt like a form of justice so pure and so potent that it was hard to tell the difference. Their logic was so deeply flawed. They were trying to negotiate with me using the rules of their old world, a world where their name and their status had value. But I wasn't living in that world anymore. I had built a new one, on the foundations of their old one, and in my world, they had no currency at all. The power had not just shifted, it had been transferred, absolutely and irrevocably. I held all the cards, and I had no intention of dealing them back in. They requested a final meeting, a face-to-face. They wanted closure, they said, or perhaps they thought one last appeal, one final attempt to intimidate or guilt me, would work. Their lawyer sent a formal request to Mr. Abernathy. Against his advice, I agreed. I knew it was a necessary final scene, a full stop at the end of a very long sentence. I chose the location, the main drawing room of the estate, the vast cavernous space where I had served them countless drinks, where I had cleaned up their careless spills, where I had stood silently in the corner while they entertained their powerful friends. I told them to arrive at 3 o'clock. I was there at 2:30. I didn't dress up. I wore a simple pair of gray trousers and a cashmere sweater, one of my own, not one of theirs. I sat in the large wingback chair by the fireplace, the one that had been Eleanor's favorite. It was the seat of power in the room. I didn't have a drink. I just waited. They arrived precisely at 3, all 3 of them together, a united front of the dispossessed. They walked in, and for a moment, they just stood there, in the middle of the room, looking lost. This was their home, and yet they were visitors, trespassers. The familiar space was now alien territory. I didn't stand up. I just watched them. Richard spoke first, his voice tight. "Bianca," he said. He couldn't bring himself to look me in the eye. He was looking at a painting over my head. "We came here to ask you to reconsider, to be reasonable." "Reasonable?" I said, my voice quiet in the large room. Was it reasonable to pay a woman the same salary for 30 years while her duties quadrupled? Was it reasonable to accuse her of theft? Was it reasonable to compensate 3 decades of her life with a rusty key to a shed you planned to demolish? Catherine flinched. Julian just stared at the floor. "This isn't about that," Richard said, waving a dismissive hand, a ghost of his old arrogance. "This is about what's right. This fortune, this house, it's our family's legacy." "It's my house," I said, my voice cutting through his bluster. "It's my legacy. Your mother gave it to me. She believed you would destroy it. And from what I have seen over the past few weeks, her judgment was, as always, impeccable." Catherine finally spoke, her voice trembling with a rage she was trying to suppress. "She did it to spite us. She was a hateful, old woman. And you are just the tool of her spite." I nodded slowly. "Perhaps that's true," I said. "But it changes nothing. The house is mine. The companies are mine. The money is mine. It's a debatable point whether this is justice or spite, but the outcome is the same. It wasn't about revenge. It was about correcting an imbalance, and now it's balanced." I finally looked Richard directly in the eyes. "I know you see this as a great betrayal, a shocking turn of events, but you should try to look at it from a different perspective, a business perspective. Your mother ran this family like a corporation, and in the end, she made a business decision. She chose a successor who she felt was competent. She saw you as liabilities, and she cut you loose. It wasn't personal. It was just severance. The word hung in the air between us. Severance, the cold corporate term for dismissal, the final perfect insult. Richard's face went white. For a second, I thought he might lunge at me. But he was a coward. All his power had been borrowed, and the loan had been called in. He was empty. "There's nothing more to say," I said, standing up. I walked over to the grand window that overlooked the gardens. "The new reality is this. You will leave my property now. You will not contact me again. You will not contact my lawyer. If you or your representatives attempt to do so, I will consider it harassment. If you set foot on this estate or any of my other properties again, I will have you charged with trespassing. Is that clear?" They stared at me, their faces a mixture of hatred, disbelief, and a dawning, terrible understanding. They were beaten, completely and utterly. They had no moves left to make. They turned, and without another word, they walked out of the drawing room, out of the house, and out of my life. I listened to their footsteps fade on the marble floor, followed by the heavy final sound of the front door closing. And then, silence. A profound, peaceful silence. I stood in the middle of the room that was now mine, in the house that was now mine, and I felt the weight of 30 years lift from my shoulders. The vindication was not a fiery, triumphant feeling. It was a quiet, cool calm. It was the feeling of a story reaching its proper end. The new reality had set in. The queen was in her castle, and the ghosts had finally been exorcised. In the weeks that followed, I didn't sell the house. I didn't change the furniture. I simply lived in it. I walked the gardens, not to inspect them, but to enjoy them. I sat in the library, not to dust the books, but to read them. I made the house a home, something it had never truly been under Eleanor's cold reign or her children's greedy watch. My resolution wasn't to become a new version of them. It wasn't about indulging in the trappings of wealth. It was about using the power that had been thrust upon me to build something meaningful. I took a portion of the vast fortune and, with Mr. Abernathy's help, established the Eleanor Vance Foundation, not in her memory, but as a final, ironic tribute to her brutal pragmatism. The foundation's mission was simple: to provide legal aid and educational grants to domestic workers, to people who live in the shadows, the invisible workforce that keeps the world running. It was a purpose that would have made Eleanor's children scream with rage, and for that reason alone, I knew it was the right thing to do. It wasn't about the money. It was about what the money could do. Sometimes I take the rusty key and the note from Eleanor out of the safe in the study. I look at them, these two small objects that changed everything. They are my symbolic reclamation. They represent the moment my life pivoted from a long, quiet servitude to a future of my own making. They remind me that worth is not determined by those who sign your paychecks, but by the integrity of your own spine. And that's why I'm telling you this story, because I know I'm not the only one. I know that out there, right now, there are people feeling invisible, undervalued, and erased. You might be working for a boss who takes credit for your ideas. You might be in a family that treats you like a function, not a person. You might feel like a ghost in your own life. My story is not about a magic key or a surprise inheritance. It's about the power of quiet competence. It's about the strength you build when no one is watching. It's about understanding that being underestimated is not a weakness. It is your greatest strategic advantage. For 30 years, I was a housekeeper, but I was also a student, a strategist, a silent observer. I never stopped learning. I never stopped preparing, even when I didn't know what I was preparing for. So if you feel like you are in a cage, remember this: a cage is also a classroom. Learn the layout, understand the locks, watch the guards. Your time will come. It may not be as dramatic as mine, but your moment of vindication will arrive. Build your own secret plan. Cultivate your own allies. Nurture your own quiet strength, because the world is full of arrogant, careless people who believe they hold all the power, and they will never, ever see you coming. That is your power, the power of being the one they always look past. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, if you've ever felt that sting of being overlooked, please like this video and leave a comment below. Sharing your own story helps all of us feel a little less invisible. And if you know someone who needs to hear this, who needs a reminder of their own strength, share it with them. And of course, hit that subscribe button for more stories about the balance of justice finally being set right. It helps to know we're all in this together.